It's 5:15. We can start now.
Good. Well, let's make a start. So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome indeed to the IFSTAL Public Lecture for 2021. The topic we'll be discussing this evening is communicating the climate change impacts of food. Very, very wonderful to see so many people coming into this this event, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting and very thought-provoking. So what's this all about? Let me just say that the IFSTAL program has been running for six years or more. It's interdisciplinary food system teaching and learning program that I and several colleagues on the call and many others have been engaged in across multiple universities to help postgraduate students get a better understanding of how the food system operates and the role of their speciality within it, so that when they move into the world of work, they're able to conduct their discipline and deliver their work more effectively because they have a better understanding of where it fits in the big picture. And over the years, we've had approaching 2,000 students go through the program, with several hundreds overseas as well. And we're very, very delighted with the interest that we see in the program. And one of the ways we communicate what we're doing is through these annual public lectures. And my name is John Ingram. I'm based in the University in Oxford, in the Environmental Change Institute, where I lead the Food Systems Transformation team, and where we also lead the IFSTAL program. It's a wonderful thing to see so many colleagues come onto this call. I'm not sure of the total count, but we're well over about 150 participants now. And what we're going to do this evening is to run through a couple of short presentations from two very good colleagues, Sarah Bridle and Dan Crossley, who I'll introduce in a moment. And then we are basically running this as a conversation. And the idea is that we will think about what each other have said and inspire some questions and some conversations around that. You're absolutely encouraged to put questions and comments into the chat, and the team in the background will be helping to select and organize those questions in such a way that they can be delivered directly to the speakers, and that will further inspire the conversation. So without further ado, I think I'd just like to introduce our two speakers tonight. Sarah Bridle is professor in the School of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Manchester. Most of her work so far has focused on trying to uncover the nature of dark energy using gravitational lensing. Now, before you turn off your cameras and you think you're on the wrong seminar, don't worry, because she has become sincerely motivated in the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from food, and has brought a wonderful experience in how you integrate different areas of science together, applying cosmology experience now to agriculture and food research. The skill is bringing together scientists and thinkers, people from the private sector and the public sector and the third sector, together to discuss something which is very challenging. And that fundamentally needs communication. And so it's great to have Sarah join us. She's leading a big project which I was involved in called Take a Bite Out of Climate Change. Some of you may know that. And she published a book September last year, Food and Climate Change Without Hot Air. So welcome, Sarah, delighted to have you here. Now, Dan Crossley, another long-standing colleague, leads the team at the Food Ethics Council. And he's worked on food sustainability issues for many years, 15 years or more. He's held a number of very influential roles, including working with DEFRA's Consumer Stakeholder Consultative Group and the N8 Agri-Food Food Systems Policy Hub. He's also been involved with the Food Climate Research Network and is on the advisory board of that. and many of you may know the work of Tara Garnett in that regard. So, but prior to that, he was involved in the Forum for Future's work on sustainability and sustainable food, and was involved through Forum with many of the world's leading businesses, and indeed previously worked for a food manufacturing company, but I don't know which one. Maybe we will find out. So what I'll do is welcome them both very sincerely to this evening, and ask Sarah, please, to give us 10 or 12 minutes of thoughts on the challenges of communicating climate change impacts on food.
Well, thank you so much, John, and it's really wonderful to be here and the great opportunity to speak to this fantastic programme, which I've come across over several years now and benefited from myself as well. So I understand you're learning about food and agriculture and how you can get from your undergraduate studies and apply that to the food system. And maybe my background can be some reassurance that it is possible to change fields. As John said, I spent the last 20 years doing astrophysics and culminating in this largest ever map of the dark matter using the bending of light by gravity. But about 5 years ago, I had an epiphany that maybe we should be worrying more about our own planet. And so I started thinking about climate change and trying to understand the contributions from different parts of the system. You might have come across this fantastic representation of climate change called climate stripes. Just Google climate stripes. You can even buy all sorts of merchandise if you're into that sort of thing. It's actually made by Ed Hawkins, who's actually formerly an astrophysicist as well. And each year is represented by a different colour, and that shows the average temperature of the Earth since 1850. And most people would agree that one side looks redder than the other, that global warming is happening. Now, as you all know, there's a huge amount of complexity as to where the greenhouse gas emissions climate impacts are coming from. This slide is just to illustrate the fact we've got lots of different activities which contribute to climate change. But how do we distill that into something that we can communicate easily to a wider audience? And I have to confess that when I'm giving public talks, I prefer to start with this diagram, just saying that about a quarter of all climate change is caused by the food system, and actually the majority of the rest is caused by fossil fuels. So if we stop burning fossil fuels, we're going to have food dominating the greenhouse gas emissions. And so actually that red part is also getting bigger because we've got more people eating more greenhouse gas emissions intensive foods. Now, as you, I'm sure, know, there's a huge range of different greenhouse gas emissions for each product. And so, for example, here we've got beef with this very big range, just depending on the production method. So how can we communicate such a complicated food system to the public? And I've been inspired in my work by a former mentor of mine, David Mackay, who was a computer scientist for the first 20 years of his career, and then wrote this fantastic book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, which was aimed at politicians to get across the impact of renewables and energy requirements. And he did all of this using simple bar charts. And that's what I've been using in my book as well, which is in the same series. So, for example, here we can see the global average greenhouse gas emissions from food per person per day. And so we're responsible each for about 6 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent going up into the atmosphere every day due to the food that we're eating. And it's useful to have some sort of yardstick to aim at here. So you'll know the results of international discussions say that in the next 10 years, we need to roughly halve our greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to keep this yardstick here for comparison on the next few slides. So the first question I ask in a talk on this topic is to ask people to guess which causes the most greenhouse gas emissions out of an 8-ounce steak and chips or a microwave potato and beans. And can you guess how different those two numbers are? Now, most people are quite surprised to find out that it's about 20 times or more greenhouse gas emissions from the steak and chips dinner than the beans and potato dinner. And well exceeds this daily budget that we've got to fit in our breakfast and lunch in there as well. And this is borne out by research into consumer conceptions of greenhouse gas emissions. People often get things the right way round, but not the right size of difference. This graph is relatively flat, even if it is pointing in the right direction. So then when people hear these things, they tend to get quite absolutist about what they need to do. They might feel they've got to go vegan, for example. But this example here illustrates that actually, if we have a large latte, then we're using a significant fraction of our daily budget for just one drink. And as I said, we've got to fit in breakfast and lunch and dinner as well in here. But on the other hand, if we look at options like a normal cup of coffee with just, say, 1 tablespoon of milk compared to going really all out careful vegan, weighing out every gram of water in your kettle, then there is a difference. But in the grand scheme of things, both of these are quite small. And it really comes down to the quantity of milk in this case. And quantities are quite overlooked in this discussion. Another misconception is about packaging. And so many people think that they are helping to reduce their climate impact by reducing plastic packaging. And what you can hardly see on here is actually the milk carton is included in this diagram, but it's so small that you can hardly see it. In this example of milk, it's much more important what's inside the packaging than the packaging itself. Here's another example where I asked people what they think causes the most greenhouse gas emissions out of a chicken sandwich, a cheese sandwich, or a peanut butter and jam sandwich. And this tends to illustrate a few different points which are common misconceptions. So first of all, people are often quite surprised that the cheese sandwich causes more emissions than the chicken sandwich, even though it's vegetarian. So that gives us an opportunity to talk about how it takes, say, 10 kilos of milk to make 1 kilo of cheese. And of course, milk comes from cows, which burp out 5% of their calories as methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. Whereas the chicken, that's coming from largely the food fed to the chicken, including soy from deforested regions, which is driving deforestation. And then finally, the peanut butter and jam sandwich. People are surprised to learn that transportation has already been included in this peanut butter number, but it's not a big deal. And people are very surprised to hear that actually there's about 100 times as much climate impact to bring the same amount of food by air compared to by boat. And in this final example, we really find out that it's, again, the quantities which are important. So if we look here, the spaghetti bolognese, we've got 125 grams of beef here. We've already blown this daily budget. But if we were to switch to, say, chicken or lentils, or even halve the amount of beef, for example, we'd make a big difference. And there's lots of examples like this in this book. It's actually a free ebook, thanks to funding from the University of Manchester. You can also get people doing fun calculations with these numbers. This is just an example. I won't go through it right now. We did this with some physics teachers recently, where we got them to do this kind of worksheet kind of question with some of these numbers and get some insights from really trying to figure things out for themselves, rather than it being something that we're teaching them and telling them what to do, which is really a guiding principle of my mentor, David Mackay's, as well. The best question that I get asked, though, is surely there isn't just one number for beef or for cheese, for example. And that shows that people are really starting to think about the problem. And I believe that in order to move forward, we really need transparency. We need to reward the food producers who are already doing great things to reduce their climate impacts, to get them at the lower end of these charts. But how do we share that information? Well, I would love to see labels on all food packets showing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's actually to incentivize producers as much as it is to change what consumers are buying. But it turns out that we really need to drive demand for this information. So Walker's Crisps, for example, did this about 10 years ago, along with Tesco Supermarket. They started to put these numbers out, but then they stopped because people just were not that interested. So to try to drive demand for this information, we started this project called Take a Bite Out of Climate Change, working with people all across the UK, including with John on our advisory board. And we did this stand at the Royal Society in London. We had these balloons here to illustrate, to ask people, how much beef do you think you need to eat to cause this amount of volume of carbon dioxide equivalent to go up into the atmosphere? And that's the question we asked people as they walked towards our stand from a distance. And maybe, you know, some people guessed 1 gram, some people said a whole cow. It turns out it's about 50 grams, so about half a beef burger. And some people were quite shocked by that. We made this game, the Climate Food Challenge. This is a great way of getting people engaged, handing them an iPad and they start clicking on things. Kids especially seem to like anything to do with an iPad these days. And so hopefully then they start to ask questions about, why is this one high? Why is this one low? We also had these food flashcards. We've got 72 of them in total, and we got them doing things like top trumps, play your cards right, kind of higher, lower type games with them. And we've got grams of carbon dioxide here, but we've also converted that into the equivalent number of minutes driving a car that would cause the same amount of climate impact. You can find out, if you're into the numbers like I am, then you can find all of the original references to the original literature, and you can download the cards and you can print them and you can sell them. It's all there for free. Then last year we were stuck in lockdown with everyone else, and so we made lots of videos and worksheets. We put out a new video every day in June with interviews with experts showcasing the work of kids in schools in lockdown. For example, here's a worksheet where we got kids to calculate the climate impacts of transportation of different types of fruit. So the kids there were saying, oh, they found that the air freighting of strawberries, for example, was more impactful than producing the strawberries itself, and much bigger than transporting by truck, for example. And we had a worksheet here which was linking to the flashcards and asking the kids to select different food options out of, like, which would you like as your protein option for lunch, maybe beans or cheese or steak, and asking them to add up the greenhouse gas emissions of those choices and see if they could reduce that, and also to look at other things like protein and calories and fibre they're getting from their food. And there's a whole load of other calculations you could do with these kind of numbers if you want to get into that. So we have a website if you want to sign up for any major updates on our new resources, but we'll put it there. And I look forward to this really fun format and this conversation. So thank you very much indeed.
That's wonderful, Sarah. Thank you very much. What a wide range of communication methods you've been employing, and a wide range of types of person to whom you are hoping to be speaking. I think we'll just move straight on to Dan, and then we'll come back together. So thanks again, Sarah. Dan, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, big thank you to John and all the IFSTAL team. Echo Sarah's point, IFSTAL, I think, is doing some brilliant stuff. I'm a big fan of what IFSTAL's doing. Hugely important that we all try and think about food systems and what that means, and try and move into the sector. There's loads and loads of really exciting jobs in the sector, so please do come and join in the fun. Massive thank you as well to Sarah. That was a fantastic talk. I've learned a huge amount already from that presentation, Sarah. Brilliant. Really loved it. And I guess first comment is, I would very much, I'm not a technical climate person. I'm not a communications expert, so at one level, sort of, what the hell am I doing here? I guess the reason I'm here, and the reason John invited me, I think, is been working, as John said, in the world of food sustainability and food systems for 15 or more years. When in my previous role, I did actually lead a piece of work called Check Out Carbon, which was talking about communicating the climate impact of food. But I guess my main purpose of me being here today is to step back a little bit, ask some of the big tricky questions, put some of the context, and think about ethics as part of this. So I will dive in. First of all, This is a sort of iconic image of the pandemic in some ways. Why have I put up some toilet roll to start with? You may ask. It's a good question. I'm not quite sure. No, the reason is when we're thinking about food and climate, I guess my line would be that we need to engage people often on this. We need to interact often. We need to be firm and strong. We need to have strong leadership on this. And there's some examples of really strong leadership happening from business, government, organisations, individuals, which is brilliant. So oft, strong, and we don't have very long. We need to get on with it. We can't afford a long winding path, which I'll come back to in a moment. We know that the urgency of this. So when it comes to this agenda, I guess the line is oft, strong, and not very long. And apologies for those of you who aren't familiar with the slogan from a toilet roll brand from a few years ago. So, in all seriousness, we do not have. We know that this is urgent, and I guess the first point is about goals and urgency. So, what is we know that we've got to act quickly. Sarah referred back to Tesco and the like back in 2007, I think it was, launching carbon labels. I was there when Terry Leahy launched that back in 2007. And at the time there was a commitment to carbon footprint, carbon label all their products, and as Sarah said, that they reined back on that after a couple of years for a whole bunch of reasons. But the point is that that was 14 years ago. Times have moved on, people's understandings moved on, but we can't wait another 14 years before we act. So however we communicate, however we engage, we've got to get on with it in the next 2 or 3 years. And I'd love to see net zero targets of 2030 and the like, rather than 2050. So we don't have very long. We need to get on with it, and we need to think about what our goals are here. So if our goal is is zero greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible, and how can we rapidly decarbonize as quickly as possible, and even move towards net positive, then that's one very laudable, meaningful goal. If our goal is we want to improve the carbon literacy and indeed sustainability literacy, which I'll come back to, of the population, that's a laudable goal as well, and those two can sit alongside each other. There might be some other goals as well that as a country and as a society and a world we want to achieve. I'm not here to say what the one primary goal should be. I think we're always going to have multiple goals, but I guess the point is the direction we're heading and the goal we're going for will affect what the question about how we should get there and how quickly we can get there. Second point is about I guess question about context. So, and Sarah touched on this before. The food system is a big contributor. Sarah's laid that out really, really powerfully, and potentially getting bigger as a share of emissions. I guess so. I mean, my point is, I guess there's questions about scale. Where do we start? Where do we? There's already some brilliant things happening. Let's do more of that. But when we're engaging people, engaging the public on this, how can we absolutely do the work that Sarah and others are doing around individual products and helping improve understanding of the impacts of people's choices, of their diets? I think that's a critically important part of it. But also, I guess there's a question about how long have we got? How can we step up and take action on some of the big impact areas? Do we need to focus down on the individual product level? Should we be stepping back and saying, actually, what are the big behaviours and big buying patterns and beyond that cause this? Is it, if we say it's food waste, is a big impact, how can we really, really drive down on that? If it's often questions about meat and dairy consumption, but recognising there's a range, what can we do about that? And again, as Sarah said, putting it in context, if I were to drive a 4x4, and I don't own a 4x4, but this is hypothetical. If I was to drive my 4x4 down to a local shop 300 meters away to buy a pack of eggs, whatever it might be, suddenly the impact of me eating those eggs, again fairly self-evidently, has rocketed, and from being a relatively low carbon, it's suddenly become huge. So the point of that is not to be paralyzed by complexity, but it's just we need to step back and think, where can we, if we think about carbon footprints, where can we start with the big feet, and keep working away at the smaller challenges as well. So what level do we need to, when we're communicating, what level should we be communicating at? A bit about ethics. I would have to talk a little bit about ethics. The Food Ethics Council, our mission is to accelerate the shift to fair food system that respects people, animals, and planet. And ethics, we think about questions like, what should we do, all things considered? And the reason for mentioning this here is, and I know from hearing Sarah at another talk, I'm sure she would echo something similar without putting words in her mouth, but the climate emergency is hugely important, but we also need to recognise and avoid tunnel vision on action on climate alone. So we need to take this kind of in the round approach and think, how can we as society, as individuals, the organisations we might work in, whether governments internationally and beyond, how can we take action and take decisions that are in the round? As I said, what should we do, all things considered? So how can we think about different environmental impacts, impact on biodiversity, impact on workers' rights for the people that are making this food, impact on human health, our own health, impact on welfare of farm animals, crucially as well. So again, there's not a simple quick answer to cover in the few minutes I've got left, but the point is we need to think in the round. We need to take urgent action on climate, and we need to engage people and communicate about that, but we also need to think in the round and get into some of those tricky challenges about what happens if a product is high carbon and high animal welfare versus low carbon, low animal welfare, which is better, which is more, it depends. Different people will have different perspectives. And just picking up on a couple of things Sarah said, things like plastic packaging, as in her example, was a very small proportion of the greenhouse gas footprint, but obviously taking that, plastic is a big issue for a whole bunch of other environmental reasons, marine life, etc. So the point is we can't get stuck in this climate change tunnel alone. We're just on mindset and language when we think about this. Often, if we're thinking about communicating the climate impacts of food, often we think of ourselves as consumers at the end of a long chain, often feeling fairly helpless here. We're one of 7.9 billion consumers in the world. We think, what is our power, agency to act? But actually, we're doing lots of work on what we call food citizenship. I think if we treat ourselves and each other as food citizens who can have a positive say on the future of the food system and can interact and participate in a whole bunch of different ways, and what we buy, what we eat, and how much we throw away is really, really important. But also, if we have pensions, are those pensions invested in supporting good food or bad food, inverted commas? Are we eating together, cooking together, all the social, mental health benefits of that, etc. So the point is, if we think in a narrow consumerist frame, then often we're left helpless and we may not get anywhere. If we shift that and think of ourselves as agents in the food system who have power through how we vote, through how we interact, through how we campaign, then it's much more empowering. We realise we're actually part of this bigger community. We can make a big difference. And I won't talk through the slide there, but you can go away and have a look at that if that's helpful. We've done some work thinking about language and avoiding consumer language and how can we empower, connect, and reframe. Last couple of slides. The question about, this is sort of, eating carbon is going out of fashion, I guess is the line, but whose responsibility is it anyway? Which is always a question I slightly sort of sigh when I ask, in that often there's a game of pass the buck here where people pass the buck around and say it's, retailers say, or we'll give all the information to consumers or customers and trust them to make the right choice. People, the public, are left going, well, we're bombarded. How are we supposed to get our heads around this? And then, governments saying we don't want to interfere, we don't want to tell people what to do, what to eat, and you're left essentially in a hiatus. And in a way, that's the way it's been for much of the last 10, 20 years, I'd argue. I think that is starting to change. And I say things like, if we look at the ideas around carbon labelling and or potentially broader eco-labelling, which maybe we'll come back to in the discussion, there are questions. For me, the big having done some analysis on this several years ago, the big impact from the Walker's crisps, etc., carbon labels, was much more about driving change down the supply chain, rather than communicating with suppliers, rather than communicating with the general public. So the point of that being, when we think about communicating climate change, it's not just thinking about the general public. We need to think about all the way along the chain. And the other part of that is which links to the food citizenship point, is it's about how can we engage, the collective we, have a collective mission, if you like, to address the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency and the obesity crisis. I could go on, but how can we collectively come together to make real rapid progress, rather than thinking, I guess sometimes people think in quite linear ways and think, how can we communicate? People sometimes interpret that as a sort of one way. How can we give people some information and then expect them to go away and solve everything? And I'm a firm believer that we need to transform the food environment so we've got a better set of options available to us. And again, maybe come back to that if there's time. And just a final slide, which some of you will have seen before, which is well over 10 years old now, from a climate change conference in Copenhagen. We've obviously got COP26 coming up later this year. But I love this slide. I'm pleased that we've moved on a long way in the last 12 years, that there are way few climate naysayers, deniers now than there were 10 years ago. And there's been some recent UNDP Oxford survey which showed that I think a very high proportion, I think it was 4 in 5 of the UK public survey believe climate change is a global emergency, which is the joint highest any of the countries surveyed. So that's, for me, is powerful. And over 3/4 of those said we should do everything necessary urgently in response. So there is an appetite for this, to forgive the pun. We can do this. How we communicate is not an easy task. I'd love to hear what people in this room, a virtual room, think of that. But I guess my final message is, we can do this. We are making a difference. We need to think in the round. As I said, we need to go beyond kind of tunnel vision on climate, but we do need urgent action. So let's experiment. Let's try loads of different things in terms of communication, and see what sticks. And let's go for the big wins first. With that, I'll hand back to John.
That's wonderful, Dan. Thank you. Thank you so much, and remarkably complimentary, I think, to what Sarah was presenting. What I'd like to do now is just myself ask you both a couple of questions that have occurred to me from what you've been saying, and I'd be really interested in your respective responses. I think it was you, Sarah, who said we need to drive demand for information, or words to that effect. And I think, Dan, you used the phrase sustainability and carbon literacy. And I'd just be interested to get your take on to what degree is literacy required, and what's the difference between that and just knowledge? So, Sarah, you're smiling. I don't know whether that's in horror or
yeah,
what,
I totally, a great question. I mean, what I learned actually from, I think it was a meeting in Oxford 3 years ago, Susan Jebb was talking and explaining, and I just saw something in the chat earlier about what lessons can we learn from healthcare. And what I learned from that was that when we give people more information, that doesn't change behaviour. However, it does change receptiveness and enthusiasm for system change. And what I see at the moment is that, it seems to me that food policies like sugar tax, for example, or taxation of climate, unfriendly foods would be quite politically toxic, quite difficult to bring about. So I think what we need to drive is this public enthusiasm for interventions in the food system, which will change our food environment. And information is just one example of an intervention, which, as Dan absolutely said, the impact is far more on the producer side than on the consumer side. But we need people to demand this, otherwise it won't happen.
What's your view, Dan?
No, I'd agree with that. We don't want us to agree on everything. I'll try not to violently agree. I guess what I'd add though is, and I guess it builds on that, is in terms of where, I guess echo the point I made before about urgency, where change happens. And we look at, without getting too systemsy, and John and others will nod their heads at this, I suspect, but Donella Meadows, kind of systems guru, talks about levers of change, and as Sarah said, information and putting information on labels, and that is important. It's an important part of the picture, but if that's all that's happening, then I think we're in real trouble. So we do need, hence if you go further up towards the higher rungs of the ladder, if you want to call it that, towards shifting mindsets, hence our work on food citizenship, then I think that's really important. So I say it's not, I think literacy and people being empowered and engaged, as Sarah said, they need information, but they need I guess the starting point of food citizenship is people care, they're just not given the knowledge and opportunity necessarily to be able to demonstrate that. So I think people do care that there is a climate emergency, people do want to, people do care that animals are treated badly, etc. And there's not one simple tool to answer that, but I'd say it's a collective thing. How can we all transform that so that we can unleash that inner kind of passionate anger, excitement, whatever, that I would argue we all have. We're sometimes suppressed, and we're not allowed to show that.
Sure. We, in our work in food systems teaching, we're very keen to promote the notion of food systems literacy, and by that we mean people able to understand some of the words that are used, to understand the relationships between those words, and to see the reason for the discussion. And I think it's that last point that's perhaps most pertinent tonight. You both made the point that we society are tuned to this. You said 4 in 5 people, pretty much on side with this as an urgent issue. Dan, to what degree do you think the ability to interpret the graphs you were showing, Sarah, is necessary? And I go back to either young people who perhaps haven't been taught about graphical work, or for older people who just miss that and can't cope with information in a graphical form. What's your take on that, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a stepping stone, hopefully, from what I found when I started looking into this a few years ago was I wanted to know the greenhouse gas emissions of what I'd eaten yesterday, as just a sort of a lay, cosmologist, as it were. And I found myself spending 3 years reading academic literature to find out the answers. And so I hope the book is a stepping stone, that to save people who don't have the access beyond the paywalls and to be able to read, appendices with lots of numbers in, that sort of thing, to be able to start on that journey. But for me, I'm not expecting everyone to read the book or understand any of it. Although actually what I think we get told that people can't understand bar charts, but actually in my experience they can. I mean, maybe I'm not talking to enough people, but actually, children will say, oh yeah, I'm shocked at how that's actually compares with that. So people might, I think we dumb things down a bit too much sometimes. But as I said, I think it's more about people appreciating that there's something that needs to change, as Dan said, rather than necessarily understanding exactly how to change things. We shouldn't be putting that burden on people.
So Dan, in terms of, I'm just going to pick up on that word burden on people. To my mind, that immediately says something to do with almost a moral stand. I don't think we should burden people. I don't think we should frighten people. We should inform in the best possible way. But to many people, they have challenges in life enough, and they're struggling on a daily basis, wherever in the world. And laying on top of all of that, not a wagging finger, but just more information. Dan, where do you stand on the sort of almost the moral side of that? Who has the moral authority to do that?
Good question. I'm not sure there's a simple answer to that. And I guess first thing I would say is, we all have a responsibility to act and to look after our planet, and that in countries like the UK, where I'm based, we need to really seriously think about what's our fair share, and those of you familiar with the sort of contraction convergence models, I won't go into now, but thinking about what's a fair share of emissions for the sort of high consuming countries like UK to take. So there's that question about fair share geographically and historically as well. But I guess just on the question about burden, not direct answer, but I guess one thing that strikes me is sometimes the language in this around climate change and the climate emergency is very negative, and understandably so, and is very frightening, and is said is putting onus and burden and expectation and pressure on people. And actually, without being too glib about it, I think there is, if we can turn it around, much as my last slide, that the positive opportunities from acting on. I think there is a, if we move away from the incremental, how can we do the bad stuff a little bit less badly, and actually recognize that there is, I've seen through the chat, there is example, regenerative agriculture, changing our diets. There's a whole bunch of things that are happening that we should get excited about, that can, if you like, it's not about relieving the burden, but that can empower us. And that's, I'm big fan of how can we be empowered on this agenda, and what can we do rather than what's the burden, what's the sacrifice. So yeah, not a direct answer, but some of that comes back to language, certainly.
Sure. And you say, how can we become empowered? By we, do you mean society at large?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's as I said, I'm probably over banging the drum about sort of collective missions, but yeah, clearly it's a collective responsibility, and people who are working in this space might feel a particular responsibility, if you like, to inform and to empower others. But yeah, we all have responsibility. We're all citizens of the planet. We talk about food citizenship. We're all citizens, and we can all make a massive difference.
Sure.
And yeah, so and some of the, again, one or two of the comments from the chat about things like some of the top line messages, things we can do in relation to food, about, as I said, like about food waste, about I'm slightly wary, but eating less and better meat and more and better fresh fruit, veg, nuts, grains, whole pulses. Yeah. I guess the point of some of those, they're slightly simplified, but actually they can be powerful. There's something that people can get their heads around, and actually there are examples where things are better for health, and better for human health, and better for animals potentially, and better for climate crisis and biodiversity. So there are some win-wins. It's not all trade-offs.
Sure. I mean, the urgency point, I think, is very, is becoming increasingly appreciated. And Sarah, in your book, from memory, you put out the quantities of different meals in this very visually, accessible way. Do I remember the urgency message? I'm not sure I do.
So I suppose I focused on what we need to do, say, if we're trying to, in 10 years' time, we want to halve emissions. That was the kind of main context. And I suppose I talked about the remaining budget that we've got, that food alone would use up this whole budget that we've got available for carbon in the next 12 years if we don't do something about it. So I suppose that this was more in the kind of introductory chapters about climate change and the overall urgency. And I guess we can debate for a long time about how much that the food system should change compared to other things that we also need to change, and how much that should come from portfolios versus, productivity changes and so on. But I think the main point is that we're citizens of, as Dan said, we're citizens of the world. We're choosing what we eat. We need to actually be part of that conversation about how our food is going to change. And so to be able to do that, we need to have some information. Otherwise, it sort of ends up being a kind of, almost it's portrayed as an argument between vegans and farmers or something, which is, so unhelpful. Sure. But we need to get more facts to have those conversations.
Another question that's sprung to my mind from what you've both been saying is the importance of explaining where the food system sits in the bigger picture. Now, I've referred to the food system as a big enough picture. The whole food climate issue is a super wicked problem, but partly because it isn't just a contained system all on its own. How do you think it's best to add the additional dimensions of the interaction of the food system with the health system, with the water system, with the political system, with the economic system, all these things dance around together. How do we best communicate that without people saying, oh my God, it's just too much?
I'm hoping you're going to
Sarah, go first.
Go on, Dan.
Well, I mean, again, I don't have a simple answer. I think we don't need to always talk about systems and interconnection systems. Obviously, in this forum, and with people in IFSTAL course and those joining, you'll maybe much more familiar with systems. It's not sort of the language that we typically use every day. But having said that, as I said, one of the reasons I love food is it's a way into so many different. So it's something tangible we can get our teeth into, literally. But it's a lens into, as I said, climate, biodiversity, obesity, and a whole bunch of other issues. And there's no simple answer for kind of where do you draw boundaries or how do you cross over them. But I think just we use the power of food to excite people. And I said very much kind of my recent philosophy, stolen from Cormac Russell, is build on what's strong, not what's wrong. So rather than fixate too heavily on where are the system boundaries and what does that mean, if we go out there, look at what is some of the great things that are already happening across in the food sector and beyond, in the energy sector, renewable energy, and let's do more of those. Do more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. I know that's very glibly put, but rather than getting too stuck in the exactly how the systems all interact, there's a place for people to do that. But I think when we're coming down to practical messages and things, we need to think, what can we do? Let's just think about the impacts of our lifestyles, and crucially, not put all the onus, again banging the drum, not all the onus on us as individuals to make the right choices. Let's transform the food environment around us so that it's better set up, better options available, so that the worst options are off the shelves. And that's
sure. I mean, obviously, one doesn't want to turn people off with complexity. One doesn't want to turn people off by victimizing any individual. One doesn't want to turn people off by saying you're doing the wrong thing. However, the point of how you then say you supplant all that with here's a better thing to do, and then it boils down to an opinion. And what's better from my opinion might be different from yours, might be different from somebody else in the street. So again, it comes back to I touched on who's got the moral authority, but then also who's got the jurisdiction to actually go out and either stand on a soapbox or write a new law. How do you handle all that stuff? Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think there's citizens' assemblies which have become kind of the sort of suggested solution to that issue, I guess, which is the idea you'd have a jury of people, randomly selected, who would get information and then, make those decisions essentially, rather than having, politicians who may not be representative and so on. So I think that the concept of that is a good idea. I think that it's, I think there is a debate about whether, when we give the people the information in those citizens' assemblies, if we're kind of almost leading them towards particular answers, or how do we provide information in a way that is not leading too much towards particular answers. So if we can get that bit right, then I think they're a great way of getting something which overcomes some of those issues that you talked about, John. I guess I still feel there's a kind of gap there, because obviously people who do citizens' assemblies give up, many days of their lives to understand the issues really in depth. And I think that, actually sometimes what comes out of those is actually a lot more radical than, anything that a politician would dare to even, say out loud. And so then there seems to be a big gap there between what might come out of that and what is actually politically acceptable, and which is going to be a vote winner. Can we imagine a time when, climate policies are going to be vote winners? That'd be a fantastic result.
Well, some countries in Europe, it's beginning to move that way, at least by manifesto. It is interesting. You bring in the role of the politician as opposed to the policy process, and the policy process is delivered by civil servants, in effect, and the politician is the person who's not going to be there next year if he says the wrong thing. So how does one provide the politician with the ammunition to say the right message without shooting themselves in the foot. Food is such a touchy subject, probably more touchy than anything else. What's your advice to our Politico gang?
Always scared of giving advice, particularly to politicians. But I mean, I guess the first thing is, I'd echo Sarah's point about citizens. I'm a big fan of citizen assemblies and juries done well. I think they're really powerful. Put some of these decisions in the hands of and trust people. Actually, when you do that, then they often, as Sarah said, often come up with more radical solutions. In terms of politicians, I mean, I think some of this comes. There's a whole bunch of I guess issues here about short-termism and legacy and sort of popularity, and again won't have time to go into them all, but one of the, it might seem a strange answer to your question, but I think one of the things we need to do is we need to kind of impose and enable long-term thinking, long-term action, long-term decision making to happen through things. I would argue in countries like UK, we need, like they've got in Wales, like Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, for example, as a mechanism that not perfect, but when done well, it's a way of any big decision and big investment has to go through that lens of what will the impact be on future generations. And again, it's an indirect answer, but the reason for saying that is that if we have some of those structures in place, then I think that will help. And we need to shift away from short-term political cycles, as I said. Then that will help give more confidence to the politicians and the civil servants that work with them to be able to invest and make some of those really big decisions that need to be made. So again, not a direct answer, but my sense is that depending on which country you're in and what their what the political persuasion, they'll be sort of more receptive or less receptive, but having some mechanisms in place that allow if you like, allow continuity and allow long-termism to happen, I think an important ingredient anyway.
Have you got your 2-minute pitch ready for that famous moment in the lift, Sarah?
What, with a politician?
Well, maybe you'd get out of the lift as fast as you do, I don't know.
Get into it in the first place, no, absolutely. Will we ever get into lifts ever again at this rate? So I think that I think that we absolutely need food system transformation. I think that's pretty clear to the experts. But I do think that it's difficult for politicians still to say, even if they understood it completely, to really say those words out loud and still have a job. We see that sugar tax, is still a bit on the edge. Is that popular or is that still, a bit unpopular? So I think that we do need something to happen on education first. I'd like to see all secondary school students in the UK doing some element of the impact of different foods on climate change in the curriculum, for example. And we, there's lots of entry points in the curriculum there, actually, that if we could get those materials out there. And so I think there is a piece of work to be done first on education which has to happen before politicians are prepared to stand up, even if they understand everything. They still can't stand up and really come out there with really obvious climate changing policies around food.
Yes.
There are some which are less obvious in terms of changes in subsidy and changes, more behind the scenes policies that they might be able to do in the meantime.
Well, really interesting. I'd like to turn to some of the questions that have come in from our audience in a moment, but I just want to ask you one more thing to the pair of you. The issue of our consumption in this country, in the UK, has an implication in many other countries, and much of the food we consume is to great benefit to other countries. Produces jobs and livelihoods and all the rest of it. It can have a significant environmental footprint as well. So when we're talking about the effect of our diet, that is food and what we eat on climate, to what degree should we offset, if I can use that word, a consideration of some of the other things that are going on, that are happening outside this country that many of us may not be aware of unless we've had the privilege to travel? Childhood labour, animal welfare, exporting drought. Those are the sorts of phrases, and how do you combine that bit of messaging in with a sort of however conjunction or a whereas type word? How do you best approach that, Sarah?
Well, I think it's very, I mean, at the moment, the focus certainly in terms of the nationally determined contributions and so on is on production, and the amount of emissions caused by production in the UK. And as you allude, since we import such a large fraction of our food into the UK, then our consumption-based accounting would give a very different answer. And so I think it's really important to do that assumption-based accounting as well as the production side accounting. I think that's a missed opportunity in the way that we do the nationally determined contributions at the moment. So I think that has to come in, and then we can take more responsibility for the impacts that we're having overseas. And I guess, we also need to be thinking, in the next 10 years about the sustainability of importing such a large amount of food from overseas, where there are climate impacts that we've, indirectly created overseas, yes, where we can't get that food anymore.
Dan, any comment? I mean, really at the heart of the ethics of the whole issue.
Yeah, and again, we've done lots of work on this, which I would, over the years, but I guess one of the elements of this is about we need to avoid dependency. So, people take the example of green beans from Kenya and providing, livelihoods in Kenya, for example, which they can do. But as you said, there's the argument about exporting drought and let alone the greenhouse gas emissions of getting those beans over here and to many other countries as well. And again, it's not a simple solution. As you said, there's not a sort of, but I guess what I would argue is we need to understand and understand different perspectives in this, and understand who are the winners and losers, if you like, and put ourselves in the shoes of those that will lose out, and make sure they're supported if things do change. But I do think we need to, as I said, I don't want to put too UK-centric perspective on it, but I think in countries like the UK, where we do import a big chunk of our food, we do need to seriously look at that and say, well, should we be, importing and exporting as much as we do? Where we are, I think in some cases it makes a lot of sense and can have lots of positive benefits. In other cases, perhaps less so. So we just need to look at that really, on an individual basis and go, well, where does it make sense? Where doesn't it? Where should, we all, in an ideal world, you zoom back out a macro picture and say, where does it make sense to grow these foods in the future with climate crisis happening, etc. And we've talked today about the impacts of our food behaviours and food choices on climate. Are clearly not going to go into it now, but there's the reverse. There's the changing climate will have massive impact on what is grown and where. So again, I'm going off into lots of tangents, but there's huge amounts we could say on this.
Yes, well, indeed, but it's because there's such a huge amount. How do we deliver a succinct message? I mean, that I think is the challenge, and that's the essence of the conversation tonight. How do we communicate a complicated message simply?
I mean, again, I'm not a kind of marketeer or communicator. Others in the call will be better placed, but I mean, I still come back to. I think there are some. First thing I'd say is we shouldn't dumb everything down. We shouldn't try and oversimplify everything. I think we do need to embrace this complexity. But having said that, there are still some rules of thumb, if you like, about as I said, asking questions about where your food comes from, about as I said, less and better meat, more better fruit and veg, wasting less food. So some of those rules of thumb I think are helpful. Not driving in your 4x4 down to the local shop. Some of those kind of quite broad brush statements, but I think are really helpful. And eating. I'm still a fan of eating fresh, seasonal, local where we can. Again, but I'm also wary of this being a kind of middle class kind of lens on things, and go, well, actually, we need to wake up to the fact that there are in the UK alone, and in all countries around the world, there are many people who are struggling to be able to afford to eat. So how can we lift them up so that everyone can participate and everyone can have access to good food and good diets? That's a whole other conversation, probably.
Indeed, just looking at some of the I think blizzard is the only word to describe this chat. Here's one in particular, which is very much related to trying to communicate a complicated thing simply, and that's to do with labelling. you showed a nice picture of the crisps bag, Sarah. Labeling is a massively complicated thing, and a lot of people are studying that from a psychology and communication and the rest of it. But can we cope with a climate label? And if it's there, would we believe it? Because the method is so contentious.
Yeah, it is a difficult thing to do. I mean, it has been done, and there's, as you know, the Carbon Trust, that as one example of an independent body which will accredit these kind of things. And there's work by your colleagues, obviously, in Oxford as well, and the Mondra project, for example. I mean, there are ways of doing this kind of thing. This is being done to some extent in-house already in supermarkets and food producers, but it takes a whole another level of effort to put it out there for the consumer. For me, as I said, I think the main driver for doing this is the producer side. If you know that you have to put a number on a packet, it changes how you produce things. And if we look at the sugar as one example of that, then when in the UK, we've got these traffic lights, and we've got these foods with a red traffic light for sugar, for example, would be bad. Well, and then they decided to change the thresholds between red and amber and green. And what they did was they gave the food industry some time to adjust, to prepare for this change in the threshold between amber and red. And what they found actually was that a large fraction of food producers reformulated so that they didn't end up going from amber to red, even though the threshold had changed. So even though a consumer, we didn't necessarily know about that, I still think that it's a very powerful thing to have these labels on packets, even if consumers don't ever look at them.
Sure, it's just a question of how many labels there is room for. I remember some friends in a confectionery company said, well, we make a small chocolate bar, and on the back of the pack, we are required to put all the nutritional content in a font size that's big enough for somebody able to read, and there's no room left because we've made the thing smaller to help in another way. And so, there's a real challenge. I once rather flippantly said the only label I think is really necessary on a product is big red sticker saying, do you really need to buy me? But my marketing friends didn't care for that.
Can I comment on that, John? Yeah, I think it again raises lots of questions. One of the questions is about, so in general, I'm a fan of transparency, and let's have the information there. It's available. Sometimes can be through barcode swiping. Doesn't all have to be on pack necessarily for those that want to look it up. But we crucially need consistency, and I think someone raised this in the chat. What we need to avoid is having a whole bunch of different metrics, a whole bunch of different calculated metrics, different methods, all communicated in lots of different ways. That will just baffle, confuse, and won't help anyone. And I said the climate label debate carbon label debate has been around for a while. It's sort of been gone, probably coming back up again. And I think there's definitely potential for it, but again, it begs question. I'm wary of the sort of pursuit of the perfect, and we're waiting for kind of perfect metrics. And you take just one example of recent research from Oxford on, and forgive the jargon, GWP star, global warming potential, and which I won't go into now. I'm not qualified, and Sarah might be able to, but I guess it's about methane and the life of methane and the impact that might have on meat and livestock, for example. And that's not an excuse to suddenly that it's okay to eat whatever meat and livestock you like, but it just adds a bit of complexity to the debate. So the point is that the science is evolving and will continue to evolve. We can't wait 10 years for the perfect metric on climate. And then if you broaden it out, Professor Tim Lang, who many of you on this will know, talked about eco flowers or eco flower labels, whatever, about, 20 or more years ago, in terms of, having a label. Should we have a label that not just has the climate footprint, but also has something around whether it's fair trade, the biodiversity impact, water, etc. So I guess I think labelling has got a role to play. I'd like to see things like method of production labelling, which is less directly relevant, but I think is really important for this debate. But I say labelling on its own is not the answer. And what I don't want governments to do is fixate and just think we can put more information on labels, put it on pack, and that will solve everything. I don't think it will. My final comment on this, I promise, is again about the level at which we often, as I said, think about putting all this information on pack. and cramming this into into something this size, a label. But actually there's almost a kind of zoom back. What if we're walking into supermarkets, local grocery stores, farmers markets, whatever, I want to be able to trust that they are taking some of those tough decisions on our behalf, that they are in some ways, they choice set it all the time. Can they choice set it on sustainability and climate grounds, so that when we walk in, as I said before, we've got a better set of options. So it doesn't need to be, labelling might be part of that, but I want to be able to walk into a cafe, a store, and know that they're taking some of those, removing some of the complexity.
Sure. We'll come to a close shortly, but just thinking back to your two really succinct presentations. Sarah, you showed a number of different methods to engage people, very, very visual. They've used the word fun, which was palpable at the Royal Society gig. The children were around there and they were all wanting to play it and all the rest of it. And I thought that was really admirable. The challenge is that the message is perhaps not fun. The way you deliver it has to be, but it's a very, very serious, unfun situation that is being addressed. And it's, I think it really needs maximum skills to engage, particularly young minds, so that they're not frightened or alarmed or feel they're being told off or anything, but so that they can move forward in a very positive way. And I like that pie chart diagram you had, Dan, which showed the different ways of getting people to think, and the different sort of buttons one needs to press. So I do think that together what you've both been sharing this evening has been hugely useful. There isn't a simple answer. However, there is a direction of change, and I think the communicating the benefits of adopting an alternative future is really what it's about. We call it reorientation in our work, that we as society accept that not the status quo might be okay, and that change is part of life, and that we need to embrace that as best we can. I think we should begin to draw it to a close. Would you like to add any final sort of comments or points you'd like to make that we haven't had a chance to, Sarah?
Well, I guess I'd just like to leave with this, maybe a vision of where it would be great to be in 5 years' time. If you imagine where we were maybe 5 years ago with something like plastics, and we've had this, complete step change in public awareness and interest in plastics. Maybe it's not all been super well informed, but we've now have supermarkets and policymakers and governments tripping over themselves to meet this consumer citizen sort of demanding change on plastic. How can we get to that same situation, but about climate impacts of food and changes in food policy? Can we get to that stage where people are, tripping over themselves to try to deliver what the public are asking for in terms of change in food systems? I don't know how to get there, but that's the vision I'd love us to dream about.
Interesting. Dan?
All I'd say, it's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you, Sarah and John and everyone for joining in. All I'd say is something that I heard one of our business forums recently, someone say, which is, the pandemic, despite all the tragic consequences of the pandemic, I guess one of the positive side effects, if you like, of the pandemic is it shows that positive change, in some cases, can happen really fast. So some of the responses to the pandemic have been amazing, genuinely, really, really amazing. So, we take an issue like, the climate crisis is a different kind of issue, but it's a global issue. There's lots of differences between comparing a health pandemic and a climate crisis, but they interlink as well. Yes, the point is change can happen fast, and we can do it. So let's get on with it, and together we can, without being too cliche at the end, together we can genuinely make real progress.
Sure. Well, there's wonderful concluding points. One of the areas of work we're now engaging on is very much around the issue of the demand curve, and at a global level one sees that potentially going up and up and up. And so from the last 50 years or so, the productionist paradigm has been how do we meet demand? I believe the time has now come to change the question to say, how do we manage demand? And that really, I think, is an important point. And that shift will be a communication challenge. And I think it's beholden on us as a community working in this area to think seriously about how we change that trajectory. Thereby, how do we change the mindset from the political expediency of saying we shall provide anything you ever want to actually saying, well, let's be serious and sensible about how much do we actually need. And I refer as a closing point to the FAO food security definition, which is very well used. It's been around 20 years or more, and it's got a whole bundle of words in it. But one of the most important words today is the word sufficient. Food security, you are food secure if you have sufficient food. And sufficient means the right amount for a purpose, and one can say the right amount physiologically. So just thinking about, what do we actually need, and how do we communicate that without being a wet flannel over everything would be something to work on perhaps together. Perhaps we can meet for another chat in person, hopefully in the months ahead, and continue this conversation, because I think we've only just started it this evening from our point of view. But it's wonderful to have had you both with us this evening. Thank you very much. The IFSTAL program, we're keen to continue. It changes each year in its structure and format, but the point of it and the purpose of it is ever more important, to help people move into the world of work better equipped to navigate the complexity, to understand the complexity and to navigate the complexity, to help bring about the systemic transformation that we need and that you've been speaking about most eloquently. So let me close the evening by thanking you both very much. Thanks to the IFSTAL delivery team, Rosina and Roger and Eleanor and Lou and Nico and Sahar and other people around who've helped with this. And thank you to the audience. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance for a more interactive session, but I'm aware of the vast amount of comments put in the chat. And I think that's evidence that this conversation gets people thinking, gets people talking, and that's really what's necessary. So I'd just like to close the meeting now and say thank you very much to you both for coming and helping us navigate this challenging area of work. So thanks everybody, and I'll say good evening and good night.